A symphony of laughter, echoing defiance, splashed across the midnight water. But as they emerged, their carefree joy morphed into a single, piercing scream. The regret wasn't just a feeling, it was a mark. The first time they came, Eleanor Vance had simply felt an annoyance, a prickle of irritation. It was a humid Tuesday evening in late July, and the cicadas had begun their relentless hum when the sound of a rowdy splash broke the suburban quiet. From her kitchen window, a warm mug of chamomile tea in her hands, she watched as a group of 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl, cannonballed into her pristine, sparkling pool, her sanctuary. She had just had it cleaned that morning, the chemical tang of chlorine still clinging to the air. Her heart, a small, weary muscle that had known too much sorrow in the last year, sank. Eleanor was 54, a recent widow, and the meticulously maintained home she had shared with her late husband, Arthur, was her last anchor to a life that had been both gentle and predictable. The pool, in particular, was a monument to their final years together. Arthur had been a contractor, a man who built with his hands and heart, and he had spent a summer crafting the pool deck with reclaimed cedar, a labor of love that still smelled faintly of sawdust and varnish. The water was a sacred space, a place for quiet reflection, for floating on her back beneath the stars, for remembering a man who was no longer there. To see it desecrated by the thoughtless energy of youth felt like a personal violation. She didn't call the police, not yet. She was a reasonable woman. She went out to the back deck, her robe cinched tight against the evening chill, and cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little tremulous. "You're on private property. You need to leave." The teenagers, half submerged in the turquoise water, froze for a moment. One of the boys, a hulking figure with a mop of bleached blonde hair, snorted. "Relax, lady. We're just cooling off. It's 100 degrees out here." "I don't care what the temperature is," Eleanor said, her voice gaining a little strength. "This is my home. You need to get out of my pool now." The girl, her long, wet hair plastered to her face, giggled and swam to the edge, propping her elbows on the concrete lip. "Come on, Jake. She's serious." "So what?" Jake said, his eyes narrowing. He pulled himself out of the water, a cascade of chlorinated droplets hitting the warm concrete. He stood there, a defiant smirk on his face, his chest slick and powerful. "What are you gonna do, huh? Call the cops? We'll be gone before they get here." He was right. They were gone a minute later, vanishing over the back fence and leaving a small pile of discarded pool noodles and a crumpled bag of chips on the deck. That was the first time. The second time, it was a week later. This time, there were 5 of them. They brought a Bluetooth speaker and blasted a thumping bass-heavy song that rattled the windows of Eleanor's living room. When she went outside, they didn't even acknowledge her. They just turned the music up. She called the non-emergency line, but by the time an officer arrived, they had already disappeared. The only evidence of their presence, a half-full bottle of cheap whiskey floating in the shallow end. The third time, they left a message. On her glass sliding door, smeared in something sticky and brown, was a crudely drawn smiley face. Below it, in the same foul substance, were the words, "Thanks for the pool party." The incidents escalated with chilling predictability. A broken garden gnome. A tire slashed on her car. A stream of crude profanity spray-painted on her shed. Each act was a little more brazen, a little more personal. Eleanor installed security cameras, motion-activated floodlights, and a 6-foot-high privacy fence. The cameras were smashed with rocks, the lights were disabled with a quick-cut wire, and the fence was simply climbed. When she called the police, they were sympathetic but ultimately useless. "Ma'am, without a clear suspect and proof of property damage, there's not much we can do. We'll increase patrols, but you know how kids are." Eleanor knew how kids were. They were merciless. They were entitled. They were a force of nature that had found a crack in her carefully constructed world and were intent on ripping it apart. She felt an anger she hadn't felt in years, a cold, hard knot of rage in the pit of her stomach. She was a woman who had lived a life of quiet grace, who believed in kindness and compromise, but kindness and compromise were not stopping this. One evening, after she had spent an hour scrubbing the new graffiti from her shed door, she sat on her deck, staring at the still, dark water of her pool. She thought of Arthur, of his kind hands, of the way he'd always made her feel safe. He wouldn't have let this happen. He would have faced them man to man, and they would have backed down. But Arthur was gone, and Eleanor, alone, was forced to confront a world that seemed determined to take every last piece of her away. The cold rage hardened into a decision. The next day, she drove to the local pool supply store, not the large chain one, but a small, independent shop on the other side of town. A man with a weathered face and a friendly smile greeted her. "What can I get for you, ma'am?" he asked. "I'm looking for something that's not for sanitation," she said, her voice low and steady. "Something to make them regret it." The man's smile faded. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a middle-aged woman, but a vessel of quiet, simmering fury. He led her to a back aisle, dusty and filled with products that were clearly not for public consumption. He showed her a small, unlabeled bottle filled with a thick, syrupy liquid. The label simply read, "pH modifier, experimental batch." "This is a new formula we've been testing," he said, his voice hushed. "It's meant to disrupt a pool's alkalinity, but in a very specific, aggressive way. It's harmless to the pool's structure, but it can have some unpredictable effects on organic matter. Makes the skin sensitive, very sensitive." He hesitated, then added, "It's not for sale, not officially. But I've seen some things, and your face tells me you've seen some things too." Eleanor bought the bottle. It cost more than she had in her savings account, but she didn't care. She drove home, the bottle on the passenger seat like a small, dangerous passenger. She spent the next day poring over her old college chemistry textbooks, her mind alight with calculations. She had been a science major for 2 years before she met Arthur and changed paths, and now that forgotten knowledge came rushing back. The key was the concentration. Too little, and it would do nothing. Too much, and she risked harming herself. She calculated, recalculated, and measured. A grim scientist in her own lab. The day came. A blistering Friday afternoon. She knew they would be back. They had a rhythm, a predictable, infuriating pattern. At 4 p.m., she went to the pool, the unmarked bottle in her hand. She poured the liquid into the deep end, watching the clear, viscous fluid disperse in a cloudy, swirling vortex. It dissolved instantly, leaving no trace. She went inside, a strange calm settling over her. An hour later, she heard them. The familiar shouts and jeers, the scraping sound as they climbed the fence. She stood in her kitchen, a small smile on her face, and watched as the 6 of them, this time 6, ran across the deck, towels slung over their shoulders. They were a confident, laughing pack, and their arrogance was a physical thing. A storm that seemed to displace the very air. "Get the speaker, man! This is gonna be epic!" she heard Jake yell. They didn't even look at the pool, didn't notice the strange, milky sheen that seemed to shimmer just below the surface. They were too focused on their own triumph, their own defiance. One by one they jumped, a chorus of shouts and whoops of glee. The water erupted in a chaotic, celebratory frenzy. But then, the shouts began to change. The whoops turned into sharp gasps. The first one to notice was the girl, Chloe. She shrieked, pointing at her own arm. A rash, fiery red and angry, was spreading across her skin, small, blotchy spots merging into a single terrifying mass. "What the hell is this?" she screamed. Then another scream, from a boy named Liam. His chest was covered in the same crimson welts. Then Jake, the leader, stared in mute horror as his feet, submerged in the water, began to turn a sickly, bruised purple. Confusion and panic began to grip the group. They started to climb out, scrambling onto the deck, their skin a canvas of grotesque, blossoming colors. They looked down at themselves, at their now mottled, itching bodies, at the patches of deep purple and angry red that were spreading up their limbs like some terrible unspooling curse. They began to wail, to cry out in pure, unadulterated terror. But it was only when one of them, a smaller, freckled boy, looked up at Eleanor's kitchen window and saw the grim, satisfied expression on her face that the truth finally clicked into place. He didn't just see her standing there. He saw the gleam in her eyes, a silent, unforgiving kind of victory. He began to scream, but it wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of dawning, bone-deep horror, a scream that said he knew, finally, what real regret felt like. The scream was a siren's call in the suburban twilight, a sound of absolute, unadulterated terror that sliced through the evening's quiet. It was the sound of a consequence finally arriving, not as a whisper, but as a violent, physical blow. The boy with the freckles, who had made eye contact with Eleanor, didn't stop screaming. He stumbled backward, his hands held up, his body writhing as if trying to shed his own skin. He pointed a trembling, mottled finger at her window. "She did this! Look, she did this!" he wailed, his voice cracking with a fear far deeper than the pain of his burning skin. The others, still dripping and shuddering on the deck, began to echo. His cries. Liam tore at his shirt, his chest a map of angry red welts. Chloe stumbled to the grass, sobbing uncontrollably, her face a horrific mosaic of blotchy purple and raw, inflamed patches. Jake, the defiant leader, was on his knees, his hands pressed against his feet as if trying to cool them, but the color had deepened, turning his skin a bruised black in some places. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of sheer panic. Eleanor watched it all from behind her curtain, a detached observer at first. She felt a surge of grim satisfaction. A justice, cold and clean, was being served. This was what they had asked for, what they had deserved. They had stolen her peace, desecrated her sanctuary, and in doing so, they had invited this reckoning. But as the screams intensified, as the word help turned into a desperate, raw chant, a different emotion began to prickle at the edges of her satisfaction. It wasn't remorse, not yet, but a dawning, icy fear. She hadn't just made a point. She had committed an act. Within minutes, the street filled with the flashing red and blue lights of police cars and the shrill sound of an approaching ambulance. She watched from her darkened window as the neighbors, drawn out by the commotion, stood on their lawns, their faces a mixture of confusion and morbid curiosity. The parents arrived, their SUVs pulling up haphazardly, their expressions of shock, morphing into rage as they saw their children. The sight of the teenager's skin, a horrifying palette of purples, reds, and swollen welts, was enough to send a ripple of fury through the crowd. A large, burly man, who Eleanor recognized as Jake's father, a man she had never spoken to but had, seen mowing his lawn with a militaristic precision, strode toward the group of officers. "What the hell happened here?" he bellowed, his voice laced with a dangerous tremor. "Look at my son! His feet! His feet are black!" An officer, a young woman with a kind face, knelt beside Jake, examining his feet with a grimace. "We're not—" "Sure, sir. It looks like some kind of chemical burn or extreme allergic reaction. We've got paramedics on the way." Eleanor's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Chemical burn. That phrase, so clinical and precise, felt like a thunderclap. She hadn't thought of it in those terms. She had thought of it as a karmic lesson, a metaphorical sting of regret. Now she was a person who had done something dangerous, something that could have a real, lasting consequence. She backed away from the window, the triumphant smile on her face dissolving into a grim line. A paramedic in a green polo shirt and tan pants arrived and began to triage the teenagers. The air was filled with a mix of tearful pleas and angry accusations from the parents. Eleanor heard a woman wailing, "My baby! Her face is ruined!" And then she heard Jake's father again, his voice now a low, menacing growl. "I told you to call the cops. The old bat next door. I knew she was a nutcase. She was watching us from her window. She put something in the pool. I saw her." A collective gasp went through the crowd, and a dozen heads turned toward Eleanor's house. The young officer with the kind face was now looking directly at her window. Eleanor froze. The darkness of her house, which had felt like a fortress moments before, now felt like a spotlight, a stage where she was the sole, glaring actor. She retreated deeper into the shadows, her breath catching in her throat. The next few hours were a blur. The sirens faded, but the quiet that replaced them was far more terrifying. She sat in her living room, the television on mute, watching the flickering images of a news report about a local car accident. She was waiting for the knock. She was certain it would come. When the doorbell finally rang at 10 p.m., she almost didn't answer it. It was the young officer from earlier, Officer Riley, standing on her porch. Behind her stood a man in a rumpled suit, his face unreadable. "Mrs. Vance?" the officer asked, her voice professional but not unkind. "My name is Officer Riley. This is Detective Reynolds. Can we talk to you for a moment?" Eleanor, her heart pounding in her ears, let them in. They sat in her living room, and the air was thick with unspoken questions. Detective Reynolds was the one who spoke. "We're investigating an incident involving several teenagers and your pool. We have reason to believe that a foreign substance was introduced into the water. Did you by any chance notice anyone putting anything in your pool today?" He was giving her an out. A perfect, clean lie. She could say no. She could say she had no idea. But something inside her, the same grim, hard resolve that had led her to the pool supply store, refused to let her. "I did it," she said, the words coming out in a rush, a fierce, defiant confession. "They wouldn't leave me alone. They broke my things. They defaced my property. The police wouldn't do anything." The detective's expression remained impassive, but Officer Riley's face fell, a flicker of disappointment crossing her features. Eleanor's confession, she knew, had just changed everything. She was no longer a victim seeking justice. She was a suspect. They asked her about the substance, and she told them about the pH modifier, about the man at the store. She showed them the empty bottle, still sitting on her counter. The hours that followed were a cold, sterile interrogation at the police station. She was not a criminal. She was a woman who had been pushed too far. She tried to explain the fear, the anger, the feeling of her world shrinking to the size of a single house and a constant, menacing threat. But her words fell flat, a pathetic excuse for a terrible crime. The officer's eyes held a silent judgment. She was a woman who had given in to her basest instincts, who had chosen vengeance over common sense. The next day, she was released on bail, a summons for a preliminary hearing in her hand. The charges were serious: assault with a deadly weapon and aggravated battery. The legal language felt like a foreign tongue, a brutal simplification of a complex emotional war. But as she left the police station, she saw the morning news on a television in a store window. A picture of Jake, his face blotchy and swollen, flashed on the screen. The reporter's voice was grim. "Doctors are baffled by the strange chemical reaction affecting the victims. The rash is not responding to traditional treatments, and medical experts fear the damage may be permanent." Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks, her blood turning to ice. Permanent. It wasn't just a rash. It was a mark, a physical, undeniable, and lasting consequence. The word permanent was a razor's edge, slicing through the thin veil of Eleanor's self-justification. It echoed in her mind with the hollow finality of a closing coffin. She had been clinging to the idea that her actions, while extreme, were a temporary lesson, a physical sting that would heal and be forgotten. But a scar, a mark that would never fade, that was not a lesson. That was a sentence. She stumbled away from the store window, the world around her a sickening blur of passing cars and indifferent faces. The air, thick with the humid weight of the afternoon, felt suddenly suffocating. She had created something irreversible. The next morning, her lawyer arrived. Mr. Sterling was a man who looked like he had been chiseled from old marble, sharp-featured, gray-haired, and with a perpetual frown that seemed to suggest the world was a tiresome, predictable place. He carried a leather briefcase so worn it looked like an artifact. He sat across from Eleanor at her kitchen table, a space where she and Arthur had shared 1,000 gentle breakfasts, and the mundane setting only heightened the cold reality of their conversation. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "Let's be clear. You confessed to the police. That confession is a rock-solid piece of evidence. The teenagers have been diagnosed with a severe atypical dermatitis, a form of chemical burn. The lab reports are coming back. This pH modifier you used, it's a proprietary blend, a potent irritant. It's not illegal to possess, but what you did with it, the intent, that's what we have to fight." Eleanor stared at the pattern of the wood grain on the table, a familiar comfort that had now been rendered unfamiliar by the sterile legal words. "I just wanted them to stop," she said, her voice small. "I just wanted my life back." Sterling's frown deepened. "I understand. I really do. But the prosecution will paint a very different picture. They will say you were not defending yourself, but enacting a premeditated, calculated act of revenge against a group of minors. They will use the police reports of previous incidents as proof of motive, not justification. They will make you out to be a monster." The word hit her like a physical blow. Monster. She looked around her home, the shelves filled with books, the photographs of her and Arthur smiling on vacations, the ceramic pots filled with her flourishing rosemary. This was the home of a monster? She was a woman who volunteered at the library, who brought soup to her sick neighbors. She was a monster, for wanting a moment's peace. "What about what they did?" she asked, a spark of defiance still in her voice. "The graffiti, the broken fence, the tire. The police didn't care then." Sterling leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "That was a misdemeanor. This is aggravated battery. The scale is completely different. Their parents, they're already in talks with a civil attorney. They want more than a criminal conviction. They want your home. They want everything you have." The threat was real, tangible. The house, her last connection to Arthur, was on the line. The cold knot of fear in her stomach twisted, turning into a fiery, sickening dread. The arraignment was a public spectacle. Eleanor, dressed in a simple black suit that felt like a uniform for her disgrace, sat in a courtroom filled with reporters and the vengeful stares of the teenagers' parents. The boys and the girl were not there, and Eleanor felt a small, pathetic wave of relief. She couldn't have faced them. The judge, a stoic woman with a tired expression, read the charges aloud, her voice devoid of emotion. "Assault with a deadly weapon. Aggravated battery." The words were a brand, a permanent mark against her name. As she was leaving the courthouse, a woman with a drawn face and tear-streaked eyes lunged at her, only to be held back by an officer. "You ruined my son's life," the woman screamed, her voice a raw instrument of pain. "He has nightmares. He can't even look at himself in the mirror." Eleanor flinched, the words striking a new and terrifying chord. Nightmares. It wasn't just a physical wound. The damage went deeper. A week later, Sterling called her. "There's a development," he said, his tone unusually clipped. "A civil suit has been filed. The parents are seeking restitution for medical bills, therapy, and a specific claim for pain and suffering. He paused, then added, "But there's something else. A parent has requested a meeting. Just you and the boy. No lawyers. No police. Just a private conversation. The mother of the smallest boy. The one with the freckles. Liam." Eleanor felt a cold dread settle over her. A trap? A new form of harassment? But Sterling's voice held a note of genuine curiosity. "I can't advise you to go. It's a huge risk, but her lawyer reached out directly. She seems desperate, like she wants something more than money." Against her lawyer's strenuous objections, Eleanor agreed to the meeting. It was held at a neutral location, a small, nondescript room at a community center. When she walked in, the first person she saw was Liam, the boy with the freckles, the one whose scream had first pierced her moment of triumph. He was sitting with his mother, his hands clenched in his lap. His face was no longer freckled. It was a mottled patchwork of red and pale, unblemished skin. It was as if someone had taken a paintbrush and randomly applied patches of a different color. He looked up, and his eyes, wide and terrified, met hers. The mother, a small, weary woman, spoke first. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice shaking. I just want you to see." She gestured to her son. "The doctors don't know. They say it's not an allergic reaction. It's like something permanently changed his skin's cellular structure. He won't go to school. The kids call him a monster." She looked from her son to Eleanor, and her eyes held a profound, bottomless grief. "You wanted them to regret it. Well, they do. But I want to know why." Eleanor looked at Liam. He wasn't the arrogant teenager she had seen in her pool. He was just a boy, a scared child, sitting there with a face that was a testament to her rage. He didn't just look like a victim. He looked like a broken thing. The smug satisfaction, the cold justice, all of it crumbled into dust. She saw not the boy who had trespassed, but the child who would live with her mistake for the rest of his life. And as she met his terrified gaze, she felt the full, devastating weight of what she had done. It wasn't an act of self-defense. It was an act of pure, unadulterated cruelty, and the real price of her vengeance was just beginning to be collected. The silence in the small, sterile room was a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. It was broken only by the soft, rhythmic sound of Liam's mother, Sarah, nervously twisting the gold band on her finger. Eleanor couldn't look away from Liam's face, a testament to her rage. The blotchy, mottled patches of skin weren't just a physical disfigurement, they were a roadmap of his trauma. He had been a boy, a reckless, thoughtless kid, but now he was a living, breathing accusation, and I wanted them to regret it, Sarah said again, her voice thin but unwavering. "Well, he does. He has nightmares. He won't go outside. He told me he'd rather have broken bones than this." She gestured vaguely at his face, as if it were a landscape of horror. "And the other kids, the media, they're calling them the pool kids. It's a joke. It's a hashtag. But they're not jokes, Mrs. Vance. They're just children. They're terrified." Eleanor tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. An apology felt meaningless, a pathetic substitute for what she had done. What could she say? "I'm sorry I ruined your son's life because you let him splash in my pool?" The thought was grotesque. Sarah's eyes filled with a fresh wave of tears. "I'm not here to get your money, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "The lawyers, they're a different story. They'll take your house. They'll take everything. But that won't help him. It won't make this go away. It won't make him look at himself in the mirror." She leaned forward, her gaze intense and desperate. The They're calling it a unique, aggressive form of contact dermatitis. They've tried everything. Steroid creams, laser therapy, nothing works. They say the damage is cellular. It's not just a surface burn. Eleanor flinched. Cellular. The word struck a terrifying, resonant chord. She had been so precise in her calculations, so focused on the physical consequence, that she had never considered the biological, the microscopic. Her vengeance had been a targeted strike, but the weapon had been a smart bomb. "You're a smart woman, Mrs. Vance," Sarah continued, her voice full of a strange, chilling hope. "You knew what you were doing. You didn't just throw a bucket of bleach in there. You researched. You calculated. You went out of your way to find a specific chemical. My lawyer thinks you might have the formula, or at least a sample. I don't want the police involved anymore. I don't want a lawsuit. My son just wants to be a normal kid again." The air in the room crackled with the unsaid. This was not a negotiation. It was a plea, a desperate, impossible proposition. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table. It was a napkin from a coffee shop, scrawled with a name and a phone number. "This is the doctor who is leading the research on their case. She's at the university hospital. She's frustrated too. She doesn't care about the lawsuit. She cares about her patients. I'm giving you her number." Eleanor stared at the napkin. The ink was a dark, definitive line, a bridge between her old life and her new, terrifying reality. Sarah was offering her a way out of the legal battle, a way to keep her home. But the price was something far greater than money. The price was redemption. "I don't know what you did," Sarah said, her voice now barely a whisper. "But you have to fix it. You have to find a way. For my son." She stood, her gaze moving from Eleanor to Liam, then back to Eleanor. "I believe you're the only one who can." She put a hand on her son's shoulder, a gesture of silent comfort. Liam, still staring at Eleanor with those wide, haunted eyes, didn't move. Eleanor sat there for a long time after they left, the small napkin feeling like a lead weight in her hand. The smug satisfaction, the cold victory she had felt, was a distant memory, replaced by a profound and overwhelming sense of guilt. She had wanted them to regret it, but she had never considered the possibility that their regret would become her own. Her vengeance had cost her everything, and now she was being offered a chance to earn it all back. But the path to redemption was more dangerous than the path to revenge. It would mean stepping out of the shadows, exposing her secrets, and facing the very people who had been the victims of her anger. It would mean becoming a scientist again, not for vengeance, but for a cure, a desperate act of atonement. She looked down at the napkin, at the words, "You have to fix it." And she knew there was no going back. The real story, the one she had been running from, was just beginning. The napkin lay on her kitchen counter like a misplaced playing card, a wild joker in the grim game of her life. Eleanor stood over it, her hands trembling slightly, the fear of the unknown a cold current running through her veins. Liam's face, a shattered mirror of her own rage, was burned into her mind's eye. Sarah's words, "You have to fix it," were not a request, but an order, a moral imperative that had replaced the law and the threat of retribution. The civil lawsuit, the courtroom drama, all of it faded into a background hum. This was different. This was personal. This was a chance, however slim, to mend a wound she had created. She picked up her phone, the weight of it feeling like a burden. Her thumb hovered over the digits, a moment of profound hesitation. What would she say? "Hi, I'm the woman who irreversibly damaged a group of children with a chemical I put in my pool, and I think I can cure them?" It sounded insane. It was insane. But the alternative was to let the lawsuit proceed, to lose her home, and to live, with the knowledge that she had permanently disfigured a child out of spite. The thought of that gnawed at her, a constant, low-level pain. She had been a scientist once, the part of her that sought to solve problems, to understand, to build, had been dormant for years, buried under the heavy blanket of grief and isolation. Now it stirred, a flicker of light in the consuming darkness. She dialed the number. The line rang twice before a harried-sounding woman answered. "Dr. Arris's office, this is Martha." Eleanor's voice was a whisper, a strange mix of bravado and pleading. I need to speak to Dr. Arris. It's about the pool children." Martha's voice hardened instantly, a professional wall slamming into place. "Dr. Arris is not taking any calls regarding that case. All communication must go through legal counsel." Eleanor's heart sank. She had anticipated this. "Please. I'm not a lawyer. I'm the woman who did this. And I think I can help. I have information about the chemical. I can help her." A long, thick silence stretched between them. Then Martha's voice, a little softer but still wary, came back. "I'm putting you on hold. Don't hang up." Eleanor held the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. A minute passed, then another. The on-hold music, a saccharine piano melody, felt like a cruel joke. Finally, a new voice came on the line, sharp and commanding. "This is Dr. Arris. I have 2 minutes. Explain why you're wasting my time." The voice was a bracing shock of cold water, direct and unyielding. Eleanor took a deep breath. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm a retired chemist. I designed a proprietary compound for pool maintenance. The substance... It was meant to be a mild irritant. I didn't know it would do this." "What did it do?" Dr. Arris snapped. "It created a permanent cellular reaction. I saw it on the boy. Liam, the skin. It's not a simple burn, it's a fundamental change. I believe it's a hyper-aggressive form of localized tissue metamorphosis." There was another silence, this one different. It wasn't a wall, it was a door ajar. Dr. Arris's tone shifted, a flicker of scientific curiosity overriding her skepticism. "Localized what? What did you just say? You're not a medical professional, are you?" "No," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger, more confident now that she was on familiar ground. "I'm a PhD in organic chemistry. I studied complex polymer interactions at the molecular level. I believe the compound I created, when mixed with the ambient pH of the pool water and the particular body chemistries of those teenagers, created a localized, non-reversal tissue transformation. I can help you reverse it. I have to." Dr. Arris was silent for a full 30 seconds, the longest 30 seconds of Eleanor's life. Then she spoke. "I'm at the University Hospital, Office 4B. Be here in an hour, and don't bring a lawyer. If you're lying, I'll have you arrested for obstruction." The line went dead. Eleanor hung up, her hand shaking. An hour. The clock was ticking. She had to go back to the source, to the scene of her mistake. She needed a sample. Her own. Empty pool, now a stagnant, algae-filled tomb, held the only answers. She grabbed a small, sterile vial she had once used for collecting water samples and headed for the backyard. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on her patio. The pool, once a sparkling blue invitation, was now a murky, green-black swamp. The smell of decay and stagnation hung in the air. She knelt at the edge, her reflection in the dirty water a distorted, unfamiliar face. She dipped the vial into the water, and a thin, oily film clung to the surface. It was the residue, a viscous, colorless substance that had once been her perfect chemical revenge. She collected a few milliliters, her hands steady now, a grim sense of purpose overriding her fear. As she capped the vial, her eyes scanned the yard. The broken lawn gnome was gone. The graffiti on the fence had been painted over. The tire, slashed and flattened, was gone, but her eyes caught on a glint of metal by the side of the pool, a small discarded earring. It was a simple silver stud, shaped like a tiny star. It must have belonged to Chloe, the girl whose face had been the most affected. a relic of her victim, left behind. Eleanor stared at it, her heart contracting with a new kind of pain, one that was not her own, but Chloe's. This was not a theoretical problem. This was a child's suffering, a small piece of proof lying at her feet. She stood up, the vial clutched tightly in her hand. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or saving her house. This was about redemption. This was about a girl who would have to live with a star-shaped earring, but a face that was no longer her own. And as she turned to leave for her meeting, she felt a profound sense of foreboding. She had just taken the first step on a path far more terrifying than the one she had chosen for revenge. She was no longer just an avenger, she was a fixer, and she had no idea what she was about to face.